Good morning, and welcome to another day in the Politico pub here at the Munich Security Conference. I'm Felicia Schwartz, Politico's diplomatic correspondent, and I am so thrilled to be here with Sarah Rogers. She's the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and we are here to kick off our live programming today. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to start, this is America's 250th anniversary. Under your leadership, the State Department is reorienting its approach to soft power, looking to far-right and conservative think tanks and charities through funds connected with this anniversary. Tell us more about this effort and what you're looking to do.
Thank you so much, Felicia, for having me. This is my first trip to Munich, and so it's good to spend some time at the pub. Hopefully we'll have some pretzels and some beer later. Part of my job is to counter misinformation and propaganda. And I come from a background as a First Amendment litigator, and so part of my job is to look for ways to counter misinformation and lies without censoring them. So sitting down to set the record straight, as here, is a great way to do it. So the idea that we have some special slush fund for the far right is a lie. That is misreporting by several outlets. But what is true, though, is that the State Department is continuing its long-standing practice of civil society, arts, and cultural grant-making in support of American priorities. It should come as no surprise that free expression is one of those priorities. So one piece of true reporting I have seen on this is that I've had discussions with a group called Free Speech Union about helping to expand some of their advocacy.
Yeah.
Other reporting I don't recognize. I'm not sure where that comes from. With respect to the 250th anniversary, likewise, there's a Freedom 250 initiative led by Keith Krach, and that really runs the gamut. We're funding and supporting all kinds of things. So I funded a series of short films by the Oscar-winning director Darren Aronofsky called This Day in 1776, where we celebrate, the year leading up to our founding. And I don't want to get ahead of my embassies because we're doing all these really exciting programs.
Feel free to break some news.
Yeah. Well, they get mad at me. So working in a bureaucracy, you have to break news on schedule after clearances. So that is a discipline I'm trying to learn. But I can sort of give you a soft preview of some of the things that we're hoping to do. So
let me just stop you for 1 second. If everyone can just, it's a little hard to hear up here, so if we could just have you lower your voices a little bit so we can keep going. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So I just came from Warsaw, Poland, for example, where I got this really touching tour of the Warsaw Uprising Museum. They're a very important public diplomacy partner for us, and we're continuing to support initiatives there. There's also a Chopin in the Park in Warsaw, and we're looking at bringing in an American conductor or musician to participate in that. All kinds of arts and cultural things that underscore some of the shared heritage, shared heritages and traditions that Secretary Rubio just emphasized in what I think was a very well-received speech.
And just to think about some of the groups that you are supporting with this initiative, I'm wondering, does the European far right, for example, even make a good ally? Just thinking about Marco Rubio's speech, for example, he called for a strong and revitalized Europe. Some of the leaders of groups you've met with, for example, don't support fiscal policies that would go in these directions. Like they wouldn't support the kind of decisions to increase defense spending. AFD, for example, has come out, doesn't support increased defense spending.
Well, look, I'm a diplomat, Felicia, so it's my job to meet with people who disagree with us on at least some things. I did have a meeting earlier this year with a spokesperson for AfD, and that got a lot of media attention. But I've also met with Germany's ambassador. I've also met bilaterally, even at this conference, with representatives of the British government. I met last week with representatives of the French government and others on internet governance. And we have a lot of these conversations with a lot of different interlocutors. So, look, in Europe, I think the point we've made is that it's not America's decision, who's elected to govern Europe. We obviously, and I think Secretary Rubio in a very compelling way, invoked some values and some hopes that we have for Europe as our allies. But our view is, we're democracies, that people should get to choose who leads them. And I think I've had really constructive discussions with the current governments of these countries. We've met occasionally with people from other parties, other significant political forces, including ones that have a lot of popular support. But, in terms of who's a good ally, I think, we certainly have views on that. But whoever's elected, we'll deal with it. I think one of President Trump's pretty much undisputed strengths is as a deal maker who can sit down with kind of even unexpected and unprecedented interlocutors and counterparts and hammer out, outcomes that make sense.
I wanted to just point to some remarks you made last month about the UK probe into X. You said nothing is off the table when it comes to free speech. If they make good on their threat to ban the platform. I guess first I'm wondering, is AI-generated sexualized deepfakes, are these free speech?
Well, so deepfakes are a type of speech that actually the First Amendment has dealt with for a long time. So deepfakes are false speech. And in a situation where an AI generation like that could be reasonably construed by an audience as depicting you or me, and they've made a lot of face of me, just so you know, in a situation that we didn't actually undertake in a way that's defamatory, we have harsh legal remedies for dealing with that. The nothing is off the table language came from Keir Starmer, and it was put to me in an interview, and I sort of echoed it reciprocally. And I think at the time, what was being insinuated was a real China or Russia-style firewall ban on this entire platform. And that's not actually, Britain, I don't think is seriously considering that. They've not, in their subsequent public statements, nor in their conversations with me, I think they're looking at a much more tailored response to that issue and some other issues. And we disagree with the Brits on internet regulation on a number of fronts, but we certainly don't disagree that defamatory, sexualized deepfakes are a serious issue, possibly redressable by law. I think no one disagrees that when it comes to kids, child protection is a really salient priority. And I think a little known fact about that brief spate of misuses of Grok is that I think there were hundreds of accounts that were immediately shut down and reported to the authorities over that. As far as I can understand, based on my conversations with X, everybody who was found to have been doing that was reported to the authorities. So we have a lot of conversations with Europeans on these issues, and among those conversations, sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree, but we don't agree that defamatory deepfakes are, people have a right to take issue with that. And we don't agree on the importance of child protection. In fact, I'm also working with the First Lady on some of her child protection internet initiatives.
Yeah, I was wondering how some of your work fits in with that, because you are a longtime free speech advocate. The First Lady's bill does propose regulating that to some extent. How do you balance what's happening in the US versus, you've been very critical of European efforts to kind of regulate this in their own countries. How do you kind of balance that?
I think that, what the First Lady's bill does, I think gets closer to an approach of kind of cautious regulation. This is a new area. And when technology seismically changes how we communicate and how we think and how we reason with each other, there can sometimes be this panicked impulse. And we saw this with the invention of the printing press. The church wanted to ban the printing press because there could be new heresies. And information's crazy and democratized, and anyone can print anything. What are you going to do? And we saw with the invention of the telegraph, there was a lot of the same kind of conversation you're seeing now. Is this going to decimate people's attention spans? You can send anyone a telegraph at any time. With the invention of the film strip, I can remember growing up in the 90s, and TV was a big problem. Is TV rotting kids' brains? You have TV turn-off week and all of this. And I don't think it's wrong for people to care about these things and to ask these questions, but I think when we look back at history, we tend to feel grateful for the impulse that says, wait a minute, calm down. The freedoms that we've fought for centuries, that Europe and America have stood for centuries and have bled for. Those are important to us. And so let's watch people adjust to this technology, and let's regulate in a cautious, incremental way that does not strangle the spirit of liberty and creation, which I think Secretary Rubio just invoked so eloquently in his speech, that has propelled our economies to where they are. So with that preamble, I will answer you more concretely. I think there are ways to protect kids online that don't amount to censorship. So the approaches that I really disfavor are where, at the platform level or the content level, so let's say your Instagram feed or a news site, you're suddenly challenged to upload identification in order to see content that the government thinks is inappropriate for children. And some of this, it's not just pornography. So a high-profile instance of this in Britain was a member of Parliament, Katie Lamb, gave a speech on the floor of Parliament about the grooming gang atrocities in Britain. And there was no pornography in this speech. She was reciting facts of crimes that were very serious. And that speech was censored on social media for anyone who had not affirmatively proved they were an adult. So it's essentially, do you want to see the member of parliament give a speech about a controversial issue? You'd better identify yourself. That's the regime that we want to avoid because it really does have speech chilling effects. And our Supreme Court has recognized, kind of the interlocking roles of anonymity and free speech going back to the Federalist Papers. So the child protection approaches that I think are better. If you want to confirm that someone's an adult, I think one way to do it is this new technology that I am going to fund some implementations of, or at least fund some discussions about and support, called zero knowledge proof, where you prove your identity. It's almost like buying cigarettes, right? You prove that you're an adult, but you don't show anything else about yourself. And your identifying information is discarded, and you're issued a cryptographic code that you can present to any website to show that you're a unique adult. You're not a bot, you're not a child, but your driver's license isn't, or your passport isn't saved somewhere. I think that's less speech chilling. Another option that I like is device level zero knowledge proof age verification. So your iPhone or your Android phone, I think we've all conceded that they basically know everything about us. So you set up your iPhone, it scans your face, it memorizes every detail of you, it can recognize you in sunglasses, it can recognize you in a COVID mask, it has your credit card, it has your life in there, and we've all acclimated to that somehow. So imagine if you bought an iPhone and while you're setting it up, it says to you, iPhone has detected that you're over the age of 18, and it gives you a little toggle. Allow iPhone to tell apps and websites that you're over the age of 18, and you toggle yes. And then all those apps and websites, they don't need to ask for your ID, they don't need to do anything that would kind of stanch or chill your speech, like, are you sure you want to see the Katie Lamb speech? Because it would just be a seamless experience, the websites would just know. And I think that is another approach that I'm interested in exploring, that a lot of privacy advocates in the tech sector have commended to me. And so that's another example of an avenue where we could protect kids without chilling speech. And I think, it's going to sound kind of cliche, but when it comes to protecting kids, I think the parents have to be on the front lines. And parents, not the government, should be making these kind of nuanced decisions about what kind of content do I want my child interacting with online. One parent, if two different sets of parents each have a 13-year-old child, right? One of those parents might want her to be able to access pregnancy prevention information, for example, that another regulatory regime might think is too adult for her. And so ideally, we promote public education and awareness on these issues, and we get parents more engaged. I think Sweden has recently had some successes on this front. Sweden decided, kids were spending too much time on their screens. They got the phones out of the schools. They engaged in not super jackbooted regulation, but just public awareness and public education efforts to get kids off screens. And underage smartphone use in Sweden has declined, and I think hopefully that will produce mental health benefits. So there are a lot of important and worthy questions to be asking about how these devices and constant immersion in this content is affecting all of us. And my office doesn't oppose asking those questions. I think it is our job to advance answers that, in our judgment, preserve values like free expression and privacy too.
One solution to this problem that you've been outspoken against is Australia's under 16 social media ban. I was just thinking of Secretary Rubio's speech. He spoke a lot about sovereignty. Why can't it be that the U.S. decides what's okay in the U.S., and if Australia wants to restrict social media in this way, that's up to them to do that?
Well, every country has the sovereign right to make its own laws. There are laws in Russia and Saudi Arabia that I disagree with. The internet is transnational, so in the case of the Australian law, it does what the DSA does too, which is singles out or disproportionately targets American companies. Now, if you talk to these regulators, they will say, we're disproportionately targeting the American companies because they're large, because they're the main players. But the net effect, nonetheless, is that these are American companies bearing the brunt of these regulations. I think the under 16 stuff is really interesting because companies over time have developed heuristics to differentiate children from adults, meaning above or below 18 or 21, for example. Because if you've got someone's social graph, you can kind of predict this person just graduated high school, he's talking about drinking for the first time, he's going off to college. You get a lot of indicators that this person might be an adult. And even if you wanted to go all the way to the dystopian demand for an ID card, adults have ID cards, 16-year-olds don't. So it presents an interesting technical challenge, like how do you differentiate a 15-year-old from a 16-year-old if there's not a government ID and children's, through puberty, like their faces become more adult at different rates, it's an actual technological challenge that I think is interesting to surmount. And I empathize with countries wanting to draw the line younger than 18 because they think, well, at age 17, maybe you should be able to access internet content unobstructed. And 16 is, in some jurisdictions, the age of consent for adult activity. So I see the logic, but when you impose regulations on American businesses that carry large potential penalties and they don't have crisp safe harbors to assure compliance, I think there's always conversations between governments. And this is true if they're regulating American cars or American critical minerals or whatever. There'd be conversations between governments on what's the best balance. And I think Australia seems to be trying to like lead the way on child protection and social media bans. And I think when you try to be at the frontier of enacting the most assertive version of a certain kind of regulation, then you are raising at that frontier new questions and new issues that naturally invite that kind of dialogue.
I wanted to ask you about sanctions. The State Department has used sanctions as a tool to kind of promote the Trump administration's vision for free speech. There's been some reporting in the European press that the U.S. might impose sanctions on the judges that sentenced Marine Le Pen to a 5-year election ban. Is that something you're considering?
So this is more in my countering foreign misinformation portfolio. So I actually tweeted about that. That story was fake. My office I've never sanctioned a judge. I have never considered sanctioning a judge. I'm a lawyer by background. I think now we did sanction Judge Moraes in Brazil, who was implicated in some pretty serious abuses that the New York Times reported, and that was a pretty singular case. He expropriated assets from Americans, and those sanctions were later lifted as part of a kind of a compromise with Brazil. But in the French case, that reporting is false.
And you mentioned some laws in Saudi Arabia and Russia that you're not a fan of. Some of your critics say you focus too much on Europe. Saudi Arabia, for example, is a place where free expression is also restricted. Why so much focus on Europe?
Well, I was confirmed to this job in late October, and my first official trip happened to be to Europe, and that was when the fine against X came down, which incited a lot of spirited discussion in which I became involved. And I think that ignited some conversations that proved actually constructive. I mean, Twitter X is like one modality of engagement, and you kind of meet your audience where they are, and when you tweet, you kind of interact with your audience in that idiom. But there are other modes of engagement too that have proceeded since then. That's why I was at this OECD Internet Governance Conference in Dublin. I plan other trips to other regions of the world, but I think when it comes to digital...
Where are you going to go?
So my staff are scheduling that stuff right now, and I'm afraid that if I speak out of turn, I will get my schedule wrong. But I expect to be in Asia later this year and also in the Western Hemisphere. Saudi Arabia is a really interesting case because that is a country that, decades ago was exporting Wahhabism and was one of the worst places in the world for women. And now it is a country that I think still has laws very different from ours, but is taking steps that we celebrate. So Saudi Arabia and Riyadh held a comedy festival last year. And that comedy festival had 3 content rules. You could not blaspheme any prophets. You could not attack the crown prince. You could not attack the country. And those are not rules we would have for any comedy festival in the United States. But I think it's notable what those rules did not exclude. You could tell jokes about alcohol. You could tell jokes about, like sex. Dave Chappelle and other American comics did their entire American sets, completely unaltered. And it's not clear that Dave Chappelle could do his entire set unaltered in every European country. So if there are impediments to blaspheming Muhammad in both Saudi Arabia and Europe, in Saudi Arabia, that state of affairs represents a liberalization from what you used to be able to say in Saudi Arabia. In Europe, it might not. So it's not that we don't recognize that other parts of the world have these issues. It's just when we engage with different countries, the history of the country matters, the trajectory of the country matters. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, this is another example of where we're funding America 250 initiatives. We're going to be doing a project with the Saudi Media Ministry where we address kind of their senior people and promote like freedom of expression and show how that freedom has led to some of these great American creative exports that a lot of Saudis love.
Well, I could sit here with you for another hour, I'm sure, but unfortunately we've got to wrap it up. So Undersecretary Rogers, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to everyone here in the Politico Pub and online who tuned in. We'll be back later today with more interviews and live content.
Thank you very much.